ώρα να αρχίσουμε την απογευματινή συνεδρία. Με τη σειρά μου θέλω να ευχαριστήσω το Μουσείο Βυζαντινού Πολιτισμού και ιδιαιτέρως τους επιμελητές της έκθεσης και την Ηρώ την Κατσαρίδου και τον Γιάννη το Μότσιανο, τόσο για την διοργάνωση της ίδιας της έκθεσης, όσο και για την φροντισμένη πάντα πλαισίωση μιας τέτοιας δραστηριότητας με μια αντίστοιχη επιστημονική δραστηριότητα, όπως είναι οι μερίδες οι οποίες συνοδεύουν αυτές τις εκθέσεις. Χωρίς να καθυστερήσω περισσότερο, θα ήθελα να καλέσω τον καθηγητή κύριο Rolf Sachsse, ο οποίος θα μιλήσει με θέμα «Ο μεγάλος πόλεμος ως πόλεμος των μέσων ενημέρωσης. Οι καλές τέχνες, ο τύπος και η ιδιωτική φωτογραφία, οι κινηματογραφικές ταινίες και άλλα μέσα ως συνιστώσεις του Πρώτου Παγκοσμίου Πολέμου». Ο κύριος Ζάξε είναι καθηγητής φωτογραφίας, ήταν μέχρι το 2017 καθηγητής της ιστορίας και της θεωρίας του design στο Πανεπιστήμιο Καλών Τεχνών του Ζάρεμπρουκ, όπου επίσης διετέλεσε και αντιπρίτανης ακαδημαϊκών υποθέσεων πάλι ως το 2017. Είναι φωτογράφος και έχει σπουδάσει ιστορία της τέχνης, θεωρία της επικοινωνίας και γερμανική λογοτεχνία στο Πανεπιστήμιο του Μονάχου και της Βόνης. Η διδακτορική του διατριβή πραγματεύεται τη σχέση αρχιτεκτονικής και φωτογραφίας στη διάρκεια του 20ου αιώνα. Έχει εργαστεί ως επιμελητής, συγγραφέας και φωτογράφος, εκτός από την ιδιότητα του ακαδημαϊκού, και έχει περισσότερες από 400 δημοσιεύσεις, οι οποίες αφορούν τη φωτογραφική ιστορία, το design, την αρχιτεκτονική και την ηχητική τέχνη. Η εργογραφία του είναι διαθέσιμη στον κόμβο, τον οποίο θα βρείτε στο φυλάδιο το οποίο μας έχει δοθεί. Ο λόγος στον κύριο Ζάξε. Professor, thank you very much.
Is this right now? Is this on? Yes, okay, fine. Thank you that you returned after this lunch break. To all of you, dear Ira and Janis, please accept my deepest gratefulness for being invited to be here in this wonderful place again. And I certainly do hope that I will be able to introduce you to the subject of my lecture with regards to the long history and great dignity of the Greek state. We had heard some of the remarks on the Germans this morning. Quote, I will not let you hear this tribute by Kemal Atatürk to the Anzac soldiers from 1934 in the score set by Elena Khatkemin in 2015 for the centenary celebration of the events at Gallipoli, but it gives a definite ground to any view of the Great War as a world war. The Australian and New Zealand Armed Corps, which is the Anzac, were a troop of volunteers helping the Greek population in their fights against the genocide committed by both Turkish and German soldiers. Then I would like to proceed to the different media in use within the activities of the Great War, from propaganda posters to the weekly newsreel in the cinema with photography somewhere in the middle. The last part of these minutes will be an account of the reception of these media and a surely superficial overview on their influences of daily life at the time, and more important, on the production of memory, as Aleida Assmann has named it, in the 3 to 5 generations after. The farther the time goes from the facts, the more any memory becomes a construction. Defining a world war historically by time is difficult. No war immediately starts as a world war, but it develops into one by either preparation, like World War II with Hitler's many activities before, or by local actions like the Balkan Wars in 1912 and 13, which more or less slowly grow into dimensions no more able to be handled by diplomacy alone, but with battles here and there and everywhere. From today's view, World War I started on June 28th, 1914, with the assassination of the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. And even here we have doubts on the recordings in the media. And nobody had photographed or filmed the assassination itself, despite the fact that there were dozens of photographers and cameramen around. So the papers had to rely on either drawings or prints, or on a photograph that shows the imprisonment of a civilian from the street, who could have been Gavrilo Princip, the assassinator, but not necessarily so. There are sources that say the photograph doesn't show Gavrilo Princip. Anyway, the worldwide coverage of this assassination could be marked as the very first level of a journalistic move towards a world war. Germany declared war in August 1, 1914, and immediately the press foresaw the European dimensions of this step. And in many states, it must not have been too difficult to convince people to join the army at war. Within the three largest conflict states at the beginning of the war until at least mid-August 1914, it seemed that there had been thousands, if not millions, of volunteers. Basically, this is a myth to which there are no exact numbers, but it gives a notion about the dimensions that could help with the definition of a world war. In Germany alone, there were 13 million men under weapons, equaling a sixth of the whole population and roughly a third of the males in the country. The massive involvement of men at arms gives another hint at the definition of a world war. The industrialized forms of killing by new weapons, from tanks over air raids to the use of poisoning gas. Despite their dreadful consequences, these weapons were understood by the different forces as important tools of winning the war and therefore established an industry of surveillance and spying as well as new forms of producing and reading maps. Something happened here. Sorry. Okay. Wikipedia defines a world war as such, quote, "A world war is a large-scale war involving many of the countries of the world or many of the most powerful and populous ones. World wars span multiple countries on multiple continents with battles fought in many theaters. While a variety of global conflicts have been subjectively deemed world wars, such as the Cold War or the War on Terror, the term is widely and generally accepted only as it is retrospectively applied to two major international conflicts that occurred during the 20th century, World War I and World War II, quote end. The varieties of conflict within the Great War will be part of all our lectures here today and tomorrow, but the media aspect of this definition is only to be found in the strange use of the word theater for battleground. An inherent part of this wiki type of definition is the speed of information to be delivered, both on the side of internal military information as on the side of propaganda, and important enough on the side of those at war, the soldiers and their families at home. For nearly each use there was an extra medium to be found, and I will come back to these means of information. The word media, or even medium, was not yet widely known except for a few scientific and philosophical treatments without larger public. Most of the humans that were not at war as soldiers or busy as part of the military industry had to deal with an aspect often enough neglected when defining a world war, its economy. War economy is a devaluation of nearly everything acquired in peace times, and it has its own pace of development, from the nice packages sent to the soldiers in early days, months and years of the war, in this case basically until early 1960 in most of the European countries, over the signing of war bonds for the richer and the erection of nailmen for the poorer ones who could spend a coin and were allowed to hammer a nail into a figure or a plate. This practice was, for instance, common in German schools. Up to the switch of jobs for those who had the opportunity to stay home. Women had to take over jobs in industry and infrastructure that had been undertaken by men so far. War economy had to reach everybody, and thus my overview on the media of the Great War starts with the poster being pasted on every corner of the cities and villages. Standing in groups in front of pasted papers, in Berlin on the columns of Ernst Litvers, who invented them as holders of results of his printery, meant that even those who were not completely literate could discuss matters with others and gain the knowledge. The first posters, however, were recruiting announcements and other official statements on war affairs that had more administrative character than any form of propaganda. We had one in the morning here, and we have it here too. Thus, the first years were full of recruiting and organizational posters, but soon things changed in many countries. The war economy brought poverty for many people, made food and basic needs of everyday life uncomfortable to reach and too costly for the average people. Thus, food rations began soon, especially the winter of 1916-17 was the worst ever known before. The differences in military strategies were openly displayed on the propaganda posters as well. The old mid-European countries, including Turkey, fully set on the power of the emperors, not realizing that there was nothing left of people's interest in them. The UK and French, as later did the US propaganda, was a lot more modern and appealed directly to the average soldier and his families. The longer the war ran, the more the Germans came into the situation to explain their behavior. After bombing the worldwide known library of Louvain in Belgium, the propaganda had to deal with the fame of the Germans to be barbarians, whereas it was easy for the British to give interest for crushing these terrible warriors. But posters were a typical medium of crossover strategies as well. They announced printed and illustrated papers, even films, and thus led people to use other media in their daily war life too. Each media specification was grounded in the economic situation of each country, and these differences had to lead to a different history as described in later books, films, and literature. We had several examples of that in the morning here. Today's historical writings, to a large extent, rely on newspapers and magazines of the time, and their illustrations came from the agencies that provided the images for these illustrated papers. However, these papers were not as common as one might suspect. The German Kriegszeitung, displayed here on the left, was offered with a price of 5 Pfennig, which may sound cheap from today's view, but was the estimate of 1 kilo of either bread or fish for the Berlin people. And outside of the big cities, nearly one could read them. A similar range should be attached to the evaluation of all the illustrations in illustrated newspapers and magazines. Whenever there is an exhibition on World War I, you will find, among others, a number of caricatures from either side. And yes, they were a medium for those in possession of the power, or at least who had so much money that they could afford to be ironic and cynical. Of course, these caricatures have meanings and they push them strongly. The Germans do not play chess, they simply destroy the playground and let the figures fall. The Greeks show the British the way out of their country with all the mighty power of ancient statues. But to understand these pictures, even in a magazine or illustrated paper, you had to know a lot, and this knowledge was not too well spread in all of the belligerent countries. There were caricatures as maps and maps as caricatures, well displaying the original meaning of the Latin word. Caricature is an overfilled carriage. But these caricatures mark the importance of another medium that was not entirely new in the Great War, but had left the specific areas of military knowledge and usefulness. Maps were distributed as such, but then they were an item for specialists, military people of some sort, and the administration at home for planning all actions of supply. And their larger versions were used in school, as these examples with their popular editions can show. There are even some elements of comic designs in them. But there were maps to be included in magazines and illustrated papers, especially on Sunday editions or special issues after certain success or heavy loss somewhere. They were, of course, part of the propaganda, again, the propaganda for the rich, especially for those who had to help with the war economy, the readers of high-priced and highly esteemed newspapers and magazines. In terms of media history, a specialized audience. These magazines and illustrated papers were, at least in parts, financed by advertising, and of course the type of advertising changed immediately with the beginning of the war. The early years, at least until the spring of 1916, seemed to have been acceptable in everyday standards to those who could afford to buy magazines and papers, and thus were the printed ads. The usual products now referring to the wartime, not necessarily urging to think of things that happened outside the reading chair. This changes in some aspects with the summer of 1916, when in France and Germany the war led to an economic crisis that was to be felt with every citizen. In the UK, people were instigated to look for products that had a strict relation to war economics, with supplying food for those materials that had to be imported or were not easily available. The Mary Evans stew, for instance, became a nickname for any cheap meal caused by unwanted poverty. And this nickname was kept at least until the 1950s with the post-war economics of World War II. Some of these later advertising were mediated by enamel signs, thus referring back to the post that I had started my survey with, as they were as easy to be recognized as anything on the walls of houses or bus stops. And they refer to another medium that hoped to reach more people than the expensive newspapers and magazines could do. Small brochures, pamphlets, and leaflets are one of the oldest means of propaganda and war information. In use since ancient times, they earned their fate of flooding people home and abroad after Gutenberg's invention of the letter printing. During World War I, he stuck to his duty as patriot and showed regular programs of the battles he could cover with his camera. To my knowledge, he did that without any assistance. Beside these projections, he produced cheap brochures with these color photographs printed, and he had them sold in issues of several thousands, at least until 1916. And he produced picture postcards, not many as the process was comparatively expensive, which guides me to one of the two most important media of the Great War, the picture postcard. We already had a number of picture postcards seen today. Postcards were an important medium in military strategies since the German-Danish and the German-French wars in 1866 and 1870. They even were transported cost-free, as they were open to be read by anyone, including the censorship officers. Until the beginning of World War I, picture postcards had become a billion issues industry, and the messages became more complex as did the imagery. The simple field postcard only consisted of the address plus a small field for sending greetings. The picture postcard since 1907 was allowed, according to the Worldwide Convention of the Postal Congregation, to have a full image on one side, plus the address and a small field of greetings on the reverse. Beside black and white, color lithography was a very common and comparatively cheap form of illustration. A black and white photograph was overprinted by 4 to 15 colors, thus emerging the idea of a color photograph. Picture postcards were the fastest and cheapest image of the Great War. Wherever a troop of soldiers arrived and took power over a village or a city, they seized the local photographer's studio, and there was one in nearly every village of the time, or a local printery, and started to publish minor issues of picture propaganda postcards, either naming their own successes or showing the destructions left by the enemy's party, often as today in sort of fake news, as nobody could justify the combination of words and images. In larger cities like Thessaloniki, the interest was greater, and the public reached far off the city's walls. When the British and French troops landed in Greece, they not only had produced their own imagery, like the postcard on the right, but had international agencies and postcard publishers do their job too. Naming the agency with their seat in Paris, like the postcard on the left, does not necessarily mean that the images were printed there. They may have been pre-printed in Paris and may have been made as photographs here on the spot. The same goes for the postcard on the right, which exists in many variations and obviously was printed in larger numbers as we have so many of them on the market, most of them in black and white, but as chromolithographs as well, a technique surely available in a large city like Thessaloniki. In Madame Saint-Remo's wonderful lecture, we had a number of color photographs too, which were hand-painted. So The cheapest version was, of course, hand painting, and most of her picture postcards were hand painted and with basically watercolors, and it was easy to do because there were many people who could do the craft. The average distribution of postcards like these, with scenes only of local interest, was that the photographer had them hand-printed in issues of several hundreds. When I was an apprentice in photography in the mid-60s, I used to print 500 copies of one image overnight, for instance, for press releases during larger fairs. And the next morning the photographer sent out dozens of boys with small boxes who sold them on the street. It was the fastest medium of the time. There was no medium faster than that. In the 1970s, I had interviews with photographers from the late 10s and early 20s who described these forms of distribution very clearly to me, and they knew they only could sell these pictures within 24 hours. Otherwise, they were simply too old. The speed of the medium was a part of its duration in use, too. The speed was the main problem of the most advanced medium to be found in official strategies of the Great War, the film. The UK, France, Germany, and Austria already had services of their regular documentation films projected in cinemas throughout the days. There was not really newsreels, as some of you in my age may remember, and they were not shown on a strict scheme, changing mostly once or twice within a month. But most of these films were produced by one big company, Kodak Pathé, formerly known as, and still owned by, the brothers Lumière in Lyon. And as we have seen in one of the lectures today, there was a Pathé cinema in Thessaloniki from 1915 to 1917 at least. These films were made by small camera units all over the world, and they were cut without any intermitting text. Normally, there was a sheet or a small brochure with comprehensive comments on the subject of the film, and the cinema had to take care for both the musical accompaniment, most of the time there was a score for the piano player, and as for an actor reading out the important messages. Now, this film seems to be made probably in September or October 1915, to my knowledge. These informations could differ from each other according to the place where they were shown. The film you see here would have had another text complement in England or France than in Germany, Italy, Turkey, and of course a different one in Greek. The marching soldiers in the street are either gruel occupants or guarantees of peace and freedom, and you do not have to change the images for that. The word documentary was not yet coined for these types of films. The Grierson definition was made in 1924 for these type of films, but the narratives already showed the ambivalence of all imagery. And you can see it, you can describe whatever happens here in this film by different words, different meanings, as we had this on the backside of the picture postcards today, several examples. I think the film is over. It was a silent movie, just to know. Okay. One last medium should be only named here without further investigation. As coined by Johann Huizinga in his 1937 book, Homo Ludens, games are a symbolic interaction on a high cultural level, and the games at play can have an important role in definition of one's own participation in a world war and its propaganda. The old Persian game of Pachisi, for instance, was reinvented by the German Joseph Friedrich Schmidt short before World War I and received its new name, quote, "Don't get angry, buddy," as the base of its success. It simply meant that anything happening in the war, inclusive your own death, is nothing but fate, so you have to learn in the game to await this fate. A similar version in the English-speaking world was named Ludo. In both World Wars, this game was a big success, being played nearly everywhere and any time. I'm sorry that I only had a photograph of World War II of an SS soldier playing this with his fiancée. The most important medium for the memory of the Great War is the one that nearly no one expected to be that important, as it proved to be a historical view, a medium in historical views, private photography. Here I should not repeat the dozens of theses and dissertations being written on this subject, ranging from personal memories to the backgrounds of conservative or even fascist strategies of fake news of lost and won wars. Fact is that there was a lively industry attracting the richer people of the old countries, showing off their travels in photographs, which could be used for scientific purposes as well. All of these apparatus, plus a well-functioning film industry, were at hand when hundreds of thousands of soldiers decided to use their last pennies for buying a camera to document their travels abroad, where they had never been before and where they would never go again if there was not something like a great war. A real media strategy long before the word was coined. Even filming started around the midst of the war, but most of the cameras were too difficult to handle for the average soldier. Iconographically, these photographs can be divided into two major groups. Images that simply represent a survival of the depicted, best in good condition and mood, to signal the loved ones at home that this war is not that bad as the news have it. The other half of the images was taken more or less by incident to be exactly at the place of some action. Most often, these photographs were taken under suboptimal conditions and show this by out-of-focus foregrounds, angled horizons, and other blurs of depiction that should not happen with professional reporters and recorders. But just these tiny mistakes add much to the vision of authenticity that these images spread, and this is exactly their problem being looked at from later decades. But the largest number of photographs were simply accompanying letters home, and subsequently most of the photographs are single or group portraits showing that I am alive and well. This is what you expect from archiving documents of war, and this is what often enough is written in history, not exactly looking at the whereabouts and circumstances of the making of these images. The young man on the left might be taken in a Greek studio, and by comparison to the typical studio backgrounds used for these photographs, one can not only name the photographer, but the settings of his existence and relations to the war. The background of the photograph on the right bottom may tell some who knows the place, not only where the soldiers had been standing, but something on the situation in which they had been, probably waiting for some transportation, but interestingly enough, either to or from the front. By finding out these tiny details in newer theories of history as a science, this is called microhistory, you are in the region of my third element of understanding a great war in media, the reception. Photographs were collected and filed in boxes, filmed or dropped in archives, and many of them got forgotten about. Next one. The veterans were offered prestigious prefabricated album and collection boxes, and in cinemas or projection halls, including some very modern schools of the time, the fame of the nation in its presence at the Great War was shown in slideshows and short films. Slideshows were an integral part of many cinema presentations in the 1920s. Had the memories of the Great War being more or less personal and addicted to a comparatively small groups of historical revisionists, things turned into a broad political force throughout the 1930s. The rising of fascist movements in Italy and Germany, and the Spanish Civil War with the fascists winning, the right-wing movements in the UK and France helped an average ideology of reference to the First World War, not having been solving all of the national and international problems, and therefore a new war was necessary. The Germans directly referred to the legend of being betrayed by the peace treatments and founded the Nazi ideology with old-fashioned military delusions of grandeur, including the most modern technology, of course, whereas the Italian fascists combined modern advertising with individual madness of strength that did not exist. What happened with this mélange is well known and no subject here. After World War II, the Great War was far away. As usual in media history, it becomes an item of fiction and humor. A number of comic strips started to play over the war memories that belonged to only to the generation of grandfathers by installing characters far away from any reality. The tiny dog Snoopy, as the famous war pilot Manfred von Richthofen, was no longer one of the biggest slaughterers of the war, but a funny figure. And the Captain Steve Trevor in comic series Wonder Woman can be figured out as either a colonial officer or a war hero of the many wars in the US Army fought throughout the 20th century. From the 1960s on, global media war was won by TV. And thus a series of documentary and fiction mixtures came to the front of historical understanding for the Great War. The historians of these times mostly being alarmed by the flatness of displaying complex political problems that led to this war and left the world in a different state. But reenactment, faction, mockumentary, and many other formats were born in the 1960s, affecting the memory of World War I. A similar media development came into being by the mid-1990s. The internet and its many platforms offered both information as disinformation. Considering the internet as a meta-medium, it shows clearly that the memory of the Great War can no longer differ in its narratives from truth to fiction, from facts to figures, from a faraway story to the remainders of ruins, gravestones, and personal relics. All of these material elements are bound together in a medial package that allows access to truth only after serious efforts of scientific work. Media history, and this is where we end with, does not mean that a newer medium puts the older ones into total obscurity. Thus, the broad layouts of the internet brought back the idea of personal approaches in books and other reading formats, as well as the return of the TV series in new formats delivered and displayed via streaming networks. They make up the wall behind which historical science has to be hidden now, only eventually making some efforts in putting sudden findings into the front of interest, as of course the centennial return of the beginning and the end. Thus, I might end with the slightly cynical TV series by Rowan Atkinson called Blackadder and its humoresque as critical view on these parts of history. The series, as the final of a character that was chasing history throughout roughly 8 centuries, ends with all of its protagonists running out of their hiding post into the mist of gunfire and getting lost in an image of horizonless grey. That's where we are in the media history of the Great War. Thank you.
Ευχαριστούμε πολύ τον καθηγητή κύριο Ζάξε για αυτή την πολύ ενδιαφέρουσα και πολύ εμπεριστατωμένη παρουσίαση του υλικού. Πριν προχωρήσουμε στο διάλειμμα, θα ήθελα να σας καλέσω στη συζήτηση σε ερωτήσεις που τυχόν θέλετε να το υποβάλλετε.
I think I have to get my
Yes.
interpreter machine, otherwise I don't understand your question. Again, thank you.
Δεν βλέπω χέρια.
So, any questions?
Το μικρόφωνο στην κυρία Κατσαρίδου.
At first I would like to thank you. Να σας ευχαριστήσω. Better in Greek. Να σας ευχαριστήσω για αυτή την πολύ ενδιαφέρουσα ομιλία. Και θα ήθελα να ρωτήσω 2 πράγματα. Καταρχάς, εγώ δεν την ήξερα. Okay.
Yes, I have channel 2, but I don't understand a word.
I can ask that in English.
Yes, okay, thank you.
For that.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
Sorry. First, I would like to thank you for this thought-provoking talk. And what I would like you to elaborate, if you could, is that I would like to thank you for the Pate movie, this silent movie. And do you have any idea of what the text that accompanied each of the versions might be? Do we have any clue or?
I have been desperately trying to find the text for this film. but no film archive I contacted had it. The film is easy to be found on YouTube, but you will not actually make it with any text. What I do know from many other film archives is that these texts were given as handouts, and these handouts were translated into different languages, and with each translation there was a different editorship. So you had a different taste. But the most interesting thing to me is that Kodak Pathé films were distributed in 1915. They were distributed in the UK, in France, of course, in Italy, in Germany, and I'm sure in Greece too. So it's very, and the decision not to have intermitting titles was a decision of being able to add it with different texts and to have a narrator doing this. And these narrators were normally good actors. They were trained for that. And we know it, I know it from German sources, of course. In German film history, you find famous actors in 1915, 16, 17, who read out international films, but of course with the German text. And of course there you have a piano accompaniment, and which makes an addition in suspense, in dramatic qualities, and so on. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, welcome. Oh, you do it in English?
Yes, of course.
Great, thank you.
First of all, congratulations. It was really interesting, everything, I mean, that you said. Of course, I'm especially interested in Serbian-Greek relations, and what I wanted to ask actually is I found in Serbian archives, but also in Greek archives, that there were some kinds of posters like Serbian war propaganda that they were showing, like, for example, some parts of Macedonia that were actually Greek Macedonia, but it was showing like that was Serbian parts of Macedonia, and also otherwise, I mean, they were also from the other side. Unfortunately, as I know, the most of photographers at that time in Serbia were foreigners. Yep. Serbia did not have photographs of their own, so that she could do that. What I wanted to ask is actually, have you? I just read about it. I have never found or seen. And I'm actually working on this thesis for about 7 years. And I really think that I would found, I mean, one photograph of Serbian propaganda about the World War I. So my question is if you have found anything.
I cannot name it immediately now, but you should think of photographs showing Serbia being distributed by international agencies. And of course they were taken by Serbian photographers, because the agencies simply had people in each country, in each place to do it. That's one part of the answer. There was no copyright for this. We have copyrights for photographers since the 1930s. Unluckily enough, the Nazis started that business. That's a different story. But the copyrights, as a printed copyright, was only given in First World War to very, very famous photographers, like Arnold Gente in San Francisco, who went to Europe, and there were 2 or 3 British photographers who went to Europe and had it done. You must differ the propaganda anyway. It's interesting enough that Kodak Pathé is a French firm, but there's nearly no French photography at the time, because only the international things did it. And even what I've seen from the French troops here in Saloniki might have been taken by Saloniki photographers and sold to French agencies. And this is one part of the thing. The other part is, of course, what you named first. Maps are a part of propaganda. I could have given a whole lecture on the coloring of maps here. So if a European map is drawn from France, of course the Germans have a dirty brown. Yeah, and if it's taken from the Germans, they have a bright blue, and vice versa with all the other countries. So this is map is a means of propaganda too. It's a medium, and the spreading of maps is basically over schools, educational media, which is not yet used for. I can assure you, if you try to figure out things like this, your dissertation will take another year or 2 years. This is tough to research. This is extremely tough to research. I know that at least 2 agencies, don't know about Belgrade, but I know about Sarajevo. There were German and Schall, the photographer who took the photograph of this civilian being arrested, which is a comparatively small man, and Gavrilo Princip was a very long figure. So I'm not sure that he's the same one. But this photographer was a German photographer working for a French agency and sold his photographs in Germany too. His name is known, I forgot it. And so you have to deal with a sort of international business in this field. And I suppose he only came to Sarajevo to accompany the Archduke, because he thought this might be interesting to sell this to magazines and prints.
If I may just add, actually from the beginning of the war, when Serbians were still in the country, I mean, before the retreat, they are, of course, there are pictures and for sure. I'm talking about actually the later period when they were already at the Macedonian front. That's the part when we have lots of blackness of loose spots in Serbian.
I only can tell it from the aspect of Germany, France, and
of course,
UK. But you can surely make clear that they all ran out of money. Throughout early 1917, money became a real problem, war economy.
Yes.
And they found out propaganda is not that important. And things switched to either to the local context, like the photographs that were shown by Dr. Saint-Raymond. She had these wonderful photographs from Salonik, which are typical products for local distribution, totally local distribution, wherever they land up later. And strangely enough, all our worldwide memories of World War I in 1917 and 18 is based on private photography. That's media history. Yeah, it's more private photography, and of course of those who couldn't afford doing private photography.
Thank you very much.
Η κυρία στο βάθος. Περιμένετε λίγο το μικρόφωνο σας, παρακαλώ.
You mentioned and you showed some lovely posters. And I thought of Edward Hopper, the American artist who did Smash the Hun, one of his most famous work. Are there any other well-known, famous, top artists who did posters for World War I? On either side that you know of?
If you know a bit about British art history, you find a few names. But
Germans?
British art history is not
Germans?
really the big world art history. So, but there are some of the British artists who are famous.
In Germany?
Germany, you only find those typical people who were doing advertising. So you have Hans Ertl, you have what is his name? I forgot the names, but they were typical pre-war advertising poster artists who did very high-priced cigarettes and car posters. And they did one or two posters for war bonds. So they were aiming at the same public, the rich ones. So, and even the Edward Hopper poster is only one, and this poster is aiming at the rich ones in America to finance the war, not really for the soldiers to go. Yes, what are you telling your father about, and things like that. And so this is a typical advertising strategy, which is imposed onto war propaganda. There are several theses on that. You can really work on that easily. Thank you.
Κάποια άλλη ερώτηση? Ο κύριος Μότσιανος.
Rolf? Another question, please.
I thought it was done.
Okay.
I'm sorry. My mistake.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There is a huge film production by the cinema companies, French cinema companies like Pathé and Gaumont. What about the German technology concerning the cinema that period? Was there a similar effort to make films around Europe or in the places where the German were?
We had several debates today on the difference of administration between Greece and France, and I could add another administrative history named Germany to it. In Germany there were companies who wanted to do the films, but they had troubles with the war administration, with the war ministry, who were extremely conservative and thought film is only for the illiterate people. And so they thought spending money on films is waste. And which was ended in 1915 when they set up a propaganda department within the war ministry. And then they thought, now we have to have the most important artists doing it. So George Gross and John Hartfield were made the filmmakers for the war department. The problem was with Jean-Paul Goergen, I've been chasing the one film they should have made for 10 years, we didn't find it. It might be staying somewhere, it might be never made. So the problem is that film propaganda in Germany was really difficult. It is interesting in the moment when World War I returned to the German public in late 1918, by the end of the war. And you had these revolutionary departments. By that time, film cameras became so cheap that people could start doing this on a low level. And then you had local filmmakers in Munich, in Berlin, who did then record all these revolutionary works. So we have a lot of films on this November 1918 until March 1920. There's hundreds of films of that. But the problem with the actual situation there was difficult. And the UFA, this famous film company in Germany, was founded in 1919 because of the difficult situation of the German film industry, because there were hundreds of firms and none of them could survive because film production became expensive. And so the economic situation had crashed completely, and that's the reason why we didn't have any of these things. France was lucky to have Kodak Pathé in Lyon. That was basically the main item. And the British had two companies based in London. I forgot the names, but they were there too, and that's it. Basically, these three companies were doing the film business of the First World War.
Μια ακόμα ερώτηση από την κυρία Κατσαρίδου.
I'm sorry, just
No, sure, no problem. I'm not fleeing you.
I know it is. It was just a short mention of yours, but you said something about the collectors of the First World War, and I would like to ask, because we have collectors among us in the auditorium, is there certain special characteristics that distinguish them from other war memorabilia collectors, or?
No, that was what I wanted to explain. That collecting started as a private affair in the 1920s for one reason or the other. We Germans named them revisionists, and on one hand, and on the other hand, it's a private memory of those deceased in the war or who has been taken over to somewhere. And from the 1950s, you have or 1930s to the 1950s, you have a big movement of military history, including a market for military history. When I started researching on the Nazi times, I had to work with these military history dealers a lot because they were the only ones who had these photographs that I was looking for. But things have changed considerably in the 1970s and 80s, and have changed into a more historical interest. And it was even that way. We have a national archive in Germany. And in the early 1980s, I had a lot of trouble explaining to the people in the National Archive running the photographic department that I have a number of propaganda photographers at hand who wished to donate their heritage to them. And they said, no, why should we take this heritage? And I said, you need this heritage because it's history. And historians had the problem that photographs were no documents at the time. They didn't consider photographs to be real documents. Of course, they were right, because they are a specific type of document. And so collecting might start with an aesthetic interest. It might start with a political interest of one or the other side. But at the end, I have the view of a historian and say, after 2 or 3 generations, any collection is important as a matter of history and is an item that can be worked over under scientific circumstances, so on, yeah, scientific values, what to say. So when I started, it was difficult with the collectors for me, because I had to cut my hair and be nice to old Nazis and so on, just to gain the imagery or just to gain knowledge. But this changed. This has totally changed, and I'm happy about that.
Thank you.